Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Take a moment to settle in, to let the day fall away. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet room where the evening has finally grown still. A corner where you can let your thoughts slow down. Tonight we're going to explore something remarkable, though you might not have heard much about it. We're going to discover the Carolingian Renaissance, a moment in history when Europe learned to read again. We'll walk through the scriptoria where patient monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, meet the scholars who travelled hundreds of miles to save knowledge, and understand how one emperor's vision preserved the words that might otherwise have been lost forever. It's a journey that takes us from the ruins of Rome to the palace school at Aachen, from crumbling Latin to a script so beautiful we still use versions of it today. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frantic race through dates and battles. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the courts and monasteries of 8th century Europe, taking our time with each discovery, each quietly revolutionary idea. By the end, I think you'll find a deep appreciation for the people who worked in silence to preserve light in a dark age, and perhaps a new gratitude for the simple act of reading these words. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's quieter moments, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for trusting me with your evening. So settle in, let your shoulders drop. Take a slow breath and let it out even slower. And let's begin our slow drift through the Carolingian Renaissance, through an age when Europe learned to read again. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to prove. Just listen and let the story unfold like a manuscript opening after centuries of sleep. To understand why the Carolingian Renaissance mattered, we need to first understand what came before it. We need to picture Europe in the centuries after Rome fell, when the great libraries went silent and the schools closed their doors. Imagine the year 500. The Western Roman Empire, that vast machinery of roads and laws and learning, had collapsed just a generation earlier. The last emperor, a boy with the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, had been deposed in 476. And in the decades that followed, something profound happened to the accumulated knowledge of centuries. It began to slip away. The great libraries of Rome had once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the works of Cicero and Virgil, of Livy and Seneca, of countless philosophers and historians and poets whose names we'll never know. These weren't just books. They were the conversation of centuries, the arguments and insights and stories that had shaped Western thought. But libraries require maintenance. They need scribes to copy decaying texts, scholars to read and teach them, stable governments to fund their upkeep. And in the chaos after Rome's fall, all of these things became scarce. Picture a villa in what had been Roman Gaul, now overrun by Germanic tribes. The owner, an educated Roman, keeps a small collection of books, treasured texts passed down through his family. Perhaps some Virgil, some Ovian philosophy, a history or two. But his children grow up in a different world. Latin, once the language of law and literature, becomes corrupted, mixed with local dialects. The grandchildren speak a rough proto-French that their grandfather would barely recognize, and the books, they gather dust, their words becoming mysterious marks that fewer and fewer people can decipher. Eventually someone uses the parchment for something practical, or the volumes simply crumble into illegibility, and no one knows how to restore them. This happened across Europe, villa by villa, city by city, generation by generation. It wasn't a dramatic burning of libraries, though that happened too. It was something quieter and more insidious. It was forgetting. It was the slow erosion of literacy itself. The written word requires an infrastructure to survive. It needs people who can read and write, institutions that value learning, economic stability that allows some people the luxury of scholarship. In the 6th and 7th centuries, these things became rare outside the walls of monasteries. The classical education system, which had once trained Roman boys in rhetoric and philosophy, simply ceased to exist in most places. The grammar schools closed, the teachers died without replacements, and whole libraries of knowledge vanished, not because anyone actively destroyed them, but because no one remained who could read them. There's something deeply melancholy about this loss, isn't there? Entire works that had survived for centuries, copied and recopied, discussed and debated, suddenly disappearing because one generation failed to pass them on. We know this happened because later scholars reference texts that no longer exist. They quote from histories and philosophical works that have vanished completely. We have the echoes but not the voices themselves. And this brings us to the question at the heart of our story tonight. How did Europe recover? How did literacy return? How did the written word survive at all? The answer lies in the courts and monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries, in a deliberate, conscious effort to save what remained and rebuild what had been lost. It lies in what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, though the people living through it wouldn't have called it that. They would have simply called it preservation, restoration, the patient work of copying and learning and teaching. Which leads us gently to the man who made it possible. Charles, later called Charlemagne or Charles the Great, was born around 742, though the exact date is lost to us. He was the son of Pepin the Short, who had recently made himself king of the Franks and Bertrada of Leon, about whom we know frustratingly little. Young Charles grew up in a world of warfare and political manoeuvring, learning to ride and fight and command, as any Frankish nobleman would. Nothing in his early years suggested he would become Europe's great patron of learning. The Franks were warriors, practical people who valued military prowess and political cunning. They were Christians, certainly, but their Christianity was rough-edged, mixed with older traditions, more concerned with power than with theological subtlety. Reading and writing were skills for priests, not kings. A Frankish nobleman needed to know how to lead men into battle, how to reward loyalty and punish betrayal, how to manage estates and judge disputes. Books seemed peripheral to these more urgent concerns. But Charlemagne was different, in ways that would only become clear as he matured. He had a curious mind, a quality not always valued in rulers. He wanted to understand things, to question, to learn. Later sources tell us he tried to learn to write, though he never quite mastered it, keeping wax tablets under his pillow to practice forming letters late at night. Whether this detail is literally true or not, it speaks to something real about his character. He valued learning even though it didn't come easily to him. He respected knowledge even though he had little formal education. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided between Charles and his younger brother Carloman, as was Frankish custom. The brothers didn't get along particularly well, and civil war seemed likely. But Carloman died suddenly in 771, leaving Charles as sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. He was not yet 30 years old, and he ruled over a realm that was powerful but culturally impoverished, strong in arms but weak in letters. Over the next decades, Charlemagne would expand this realm dramatically. He conquered the Lombards in Italy, subjugated the Saxons after decades of brutal warfare, pushed into Spain against the Muslim Emirates, and brought Bavaria and other Germanic territories under his control. By 800, when the Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day, he ruled most of Western Europe. He had become, in effect, the first Holy Roman Emperor, though that title wouldn't be used officially for some time. But military conquest was only part of Charlemagne's vision. Somewhere in those years of expansion, he developed another ambition, one that would prove even more lasting than his military victories. He wanted his empire to be literate. He wanted his clergy to be educated, his laws to be written clearly, his administration to function with written records and standardized procedures. He wanted, in short, to rebuild the infrastructure of learning that had crumbled since Rome's fall. This was a radical idea for its time. Previous Frankish kings had been content with oral traditions, with local customs, with a kind of rough-and-ready governance that relied on personal relationships and military might. Charlemagne wanted something more sophisticated, more organised, more permanent. He wanted an empire that could read and write its own story. The question was how to achieve this in a realm where most people, even most nobles, were illiterate, where educated clergy were rare and often poorly trained, where books themselves were scarce and expensive, where there wasn't even a standardised form of Latin anymore, the language having fragmented into dozens of regional dialects and corruptions. The challenge seemed almost insurmountable. And it's here that Charlemagne made one of the most important decisions of his reign. He decided to import expertise. He decided to gather scholars from across Europe and beyond to create a court of learning that could serve as a model and a training ground. And the first and most important of these scholars was an Englishman named Alcuin, who came from the monastery at York and who would become the architect of the Carolingian Renaissance. Let that thought settle as we turn to meet him. Alcuin was born in Northumbria around 735, into a world very different from Charlemagne's Francia. England at this time was divided into several kingdoms, but Northumbria had developed a remarkable intellectual culture. The monastery at York, where Alcuin would spend most of his early life, housed one of the finest libraries in Europe. It had survived the chaos that had destroyed so many continental libraries, partly through geographic isolation, partly through the dedication of successive generations of monks. The library at York was Alcuin's education. He studied under Archbishop Egbert, learning Latin and Greek, theology and rhetoric, mathematics and astronomy. He read Virgil and Cicero, Augustine and Jerome, Bede and Boethius. He learned to write in the clear, beautiful script that Northumbrian scribes had perfected. He became, in short, exactly the kind of educated scholar that had become so rare on the continent. Alcuin might have lived his entire life in York, teaching and writing in relative obscurity. But in 781, he travelled to Rome on church business, and on his way back he stopped at Parma, where he met Charlemagne. The meeting changed both their lives. We don't know exactly what they discussed at that first encounter, but we can imagine Charlemagne always curious, always questioning, finding in Alcuin someone who could answer his questions about grammar and rhetoric, about theology and history, about the classical learning that the emperor knew existed but had never properly accessed. And we can imagine Alcuin finding in Charlemagne a ruler who actually valued what Alcuin could offer, who saw education not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Charlemagne invited Alcuin to join his court. It took some time to arrange. Alcuin had responsibilities in York, obligations to his monastery and his students, but by 782 he had made the journey to Francia, to the palace at Aachen, to take up a position that didn't quite exist yet. He would be, in effect, Charlemagne's Minister of Education, though no such title had been used before. He would be the master of the palace school, the royal librarian, the chief adviser on all matters intellectual and educational. He would be, in his own quiet way, one of the most powerful men in Europe. What Alcuin found when he arrived must have been both discouraging and exciting. Discouraging because the level of education was so low, even among the clergy who were supposed to be literate. Many priests couldn't read Latin properly. They stumbled through the liturgy, mispronouncing words, misunderstanding meanings. Theological knowledge was minimal. The 7 liberal arts, the foundation of classical education, were barely taught anywhere. Books were rare and often badly copied, full of errors that had accumulated over generations. But it was also exciting because Charlemagne gave Alcuin resources and authority. The emperor wanted reform, and he was willing to back it with political power and funding. Alcuin could requisition scribes, establish schools, import books from England and Italy, set standards for education and literacy. He had, in effect, a blank slate on which to rebuild European learning. Alcuin's approach was methodical and patient. He didn't try to create a university in the modern sense or to educate the entire population. Those ideas would have seemed absurd. Instead, he focused on creating a core of educated people who could then teach others. He established the palace school at Aachen, where young nobles and promising clergy could learn proper Latin, study the classical curriculum, and develop the skills needed to administer a literate empire. He gathered other scholars, creating a community of learning that became known as the Palace Academy. And perhaps most importantly, Alcuin began a program of textual correction and preservation. He set scribes to work copying manuscripts, but not just copying them mechanically. They were to correct errors, standardize spelling, make the texts readable and accurate. He developed what would become known as Carolingian minuscule, a new form of handwriting that was clearer and more efficient than the various scripts then in use. This script would eventually become the basis for our modern lowercase letters. Alcuin worked at Aachen for about 15 years before retiring to Tours to serve as abbot there. But in those 15 years, he laid the foundation for everything that followed. He showed that it was possible to raise educational standards, to create literate administrators, to preserve and transmit classical learning. He proved that Charlemagne's vision wasn't just a noble dream, but an achievable goal. And that achievement began with one simple thing: the palace school, where students gathered to learn in a way that Europe hadn't seen for centuries. Which brings us to consider what happened in those classrooms, what subjects were taught, what it meant to be educated in Carolingian times. The palace school at Aachen wasn't a building in the way we think of schools today. It was more like a collection of teachers and students who gathered wherever Charlemagne's court happened to be, though Aachen served as the main residence. Picture a large room in the palace, perhaps with long tables where students could sit and write, shelves holding the precious manuscripts that served as textbooks, windows letting in the northern light that was best for reading. The students were a mixed group. Some were the sons of nobles, sent to court partly for education, but also to forge connections and learn courtly ways. Others were young clergy, preparing for positions in the church administration. A few were exceptionally talented students from humbler backgrounds who had been identified as promising. All were male, as was standard for formal education at this time, though we'll discover later that women weren't entirely absent from Carolingian intellectual life. What did they learn? Alcuin and his fellow teachers based the curriculum on the 7 liberal arts, the foundation of classical education that had been developed in late antiquity. These were divided into 2 groups, the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar meant Latin grammar, the foundation of everything else. Students learned to read and write correct Latin, to pass sentences, to understand the structure and beauty of the language. They memorized paradigms and conjugations, read excerpts from classical authors, practiced composition. This wasn't dry or boring to them, or at least not entirely. For students who had grown up speaking rough Frankish or other Germanic languages, learning proper Latin was like gaining access to a vast library of knowledge. It was the key that unlocked everything else. Rhetoric built on grammar, teaching students how to speak persuasively, how to construct arguments, how to write letters and official documents. This was intensely practical knowledge for future administrators. They studied the classical rhetorical handbooks, learned the different types of speeches, practiced composing orations on various themes. They learned that words had power, that how you said something mattered almost as much as what you said. Logic, the third part of the trivium, taught students to think clearly, to identify fallacies, to construct valid arguments. They studied Aristotle's logical works, at least the portions available in Latin translation, and learned to apply logical principles to theological and philosophical questions. This was more abstract than grammar or rhetoric, but Alcuin considered it essential. An educated person needed to think clearly, to distinguish truth from error, to defend the faith against heresy through reasoned argument. The quadrivium was more advanced, consisting of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Arithmetic meant not just basic calculation, but number theory, the properties of numbers, mathematical relationships. Students learned to see numbers not just as practical tools, but as expressions of divine order. Geometry involved the study of shapes and measurements, practical for building and land surveying, but also theoretical, exploring the mathematical principles that undergirded creation itself. Music in this context meant music theory, the mathematical relationships between notes and intervals, the modes and scales that structured medieval chant. And astronomy meant the study of the heavens, the movements of stars and planets, the calculation of the calendar and the dates of Easter. These weren't separate from theology. They were ways of understanding God's creation, of seeing the order and beauty that divine wisdom had embedded in the world. The teaching methods were traditional, based on reading, memorization, and discussion. Students would read a text aloud, perhaps a passage from Virgil, or a chapter from the Bible. The teacher would explain difficult words and concepts, point out rhetorical devices or theological implications. Students might memorize significant passages, recite them back, discuss their meaning. There were exercises in composition, debates on set topics, practice in the various arts. It sounds rigorous, and it was. But there was also joy in it, at least for some students. The sources from the Palace School showed genuine intellectual excitement, a sense of discovery. These young men were learning to read texts that had been closed books to their fathers. They were gaining access to a world of ideas that had seemed lost. They were becoming part of a community of learning that stretched back through Augustine and Jerome to Cicero and Virgil and beyond. Charlemagne himself sometimes attended lessons, or so the sources tell us. He would sit with the students, ask questions, encourage debates. He never became a truly learned man in the classical sense, but he was genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, and his presence sent a powerful message. Learning mattered. The emperor himself valued it, and so should everyone else. The Palace School never had huge numbers of students, perhaps a few dozen at most at any given time. But those students went on to become bishops and abbots, royal advisors and administrators. They carried what they had learned to monasteries and cathedrals across the empire. They established schools of their own, copying the Aachen model. They became teachers of the next generation. And in this way, the educational reform that began in one room at Aachen spread slowly across Europe, transforming how knowledge was transmitted and preserved. And central to that preservation was the work done in the scriptoria, the writing rooms where monks copied manuscripts with patient dedication, which is where our attention turns next. If the Palace School was the mind of the Carolingian Renaissance, the scriptoria were its hands. These were the writing rooms in monasteries across the empire where monks sat for hours each day, copying manuscript letter by letter, line by line, page by page. It was slow, painstaking work, demanding intense concentration and physical endurance, and it was absolutely essential to the survival of Western learning. Picture a scriptorium in a Carolingian monastery. It might be a separate room or just a designated area in the cloister. There would be writing desks, angled to catch the best light, and stools for the scribes. In winter there might be no heat, because fire was too dangerous around precious parchment and manuscripts. The scribes would work with numb fingers, taking breaks to warm their hands before returning to their task. Each scribe had his tools arranged carefully before him. Parchment, made from specially prepared animal skins, expensive and precious. Quills, cut from goose feathers and carefully trimmed to create a fine point. Ink made from oak galls and iron sulfate, producing a dark brown-black colour that would last for centuries. A knife for scraping away mistakes. A ruler and compass for marking lines and margins, and most importantly, an exemplar, the manuscript being copied. The work required extraordinary precision. Medieval manuscripts were written without spaces between words, making them difficult to read if you weren't trained. The scribe had to understand what he was copying well enough to know where one word ended and another began. He had to maintain consistent letter forms, spacing, and line height. He had to avoid errors, but when errors occurred, and they did, He had to correct them carefully without ruining the page, and he had to do this for hours at a time, day after day. Week after week, a large manuscript might take months to complete. Bibles could take years. One scribe at Tours calculated that he had copied more than 42,000 lines of text, which he noted was equivalent to writing the entire Bible 1.5 times. The physical toll was real. Scribes complained of aching backs, cramped hands, strained eyes. One colophon, the note scribe sometimes added at the end of a manuscript, reads, quote, 0. Yet despite the difficulty, this work was considered holy. The scribes were preserving God's word, transmitting the wisdom of the Church Fathers, saving the learning that might otherwise be lost. Copying scripture was an act of devotion, a way of praying with your hands, and copying classical texts was seen as preserving the wisdom that God had allowed the pagans to discover, knowledge that could serve Christian purposes. Under Alcuin's direction, the scriptoria became more organised and more productive. He established standards for how texts should be copied, how pages should be laid out, how corrections should be made. He promoted the use of Caroline minuscule, the new script that was clearer and more efficient than the various regional hands then in use. This script used distinct letter forms, clear spaces between words, and a consistency that made texts much easier to read. The impact of this standardization cannot be overstated. Caroline minuscule helped create a common written culture across Charlemagne's empire. A manuscript copied in Tours could be read easily in Fulda or Corbie or St. Gall. Scribes could move between scriptoria and understand each other's work. Errors in copying decreased because the script was clearer. And perhaps most importantly, more books could be produced because scribes could work more quickly and efficiently. Alcuin also worked to ensure that what was being copied was accurate. He obtained good exemplars from Italy and England, manuscripts that were relatively free of errors. He set scholars to work comparing different versions of texts, identifying corruptions, restoring original readings where possible. This textual criticism wasn't as systematic as modern scholarship, but it was a significant improvement over simply copying whatever manuscript happened to be available, errors and all. The Carolingian scriptoria copied everything they could find. Biblical texts, certainly. The Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory. Liturgical texts for the Mass and the Divine Office. But also grammar textbooks, classical poetry, history, philosophy, scientific works. Virgil's Aeneid was copied repeatedly. So were Cicero's rhetorical works, Boethius's philosophical writings, the natural histories of Pliny. If a monastery had a text, or could borrow one, it was likely to be copied, adding to the monastery's library and creating new exemplars that could be shared with other institutions. We owe an immense debt to these anonymous scribes. Most of the classical Latin literature that survives today does so because Carolingian scribes copied it. Texts that had existed in only 1 or 2 crumbling manuscripts were copied multiple times, creating new exemplars that could survive into later centuries. Works that had been corrupted through centuries of copying were corrected and restored. The Carolingian scriptoria didn't save everything. Many texts were still lost, either because they weren't available to be copied, or because they were considered unimportant or even dangerous. But they saved enough to preserve the core of Western classical learning, passing it on to later generations who would build on that foundation. And the method they used, the careful copying and correction, the beautiful clear script, the patient dedication to accuracy, became a model for medieval book production for centuries to come, spreading the light they had preserved into new corners of darkness. Among all the achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance, one of the most lasting was also one of the most practical: the development and spread of Caroline minuscule, a new way of writing that would transform European literacy and eventually give us the lowercase letters we use today. Before the Carolingian reforms, Europe had no standard script. Different regions, different monasteries, even different scribes within the same monastery might use different letter forms. Some scripts were descended from ancient Roman writing, others from later uncial or half-uncial styles. Many were difficult to read, with letters that looked similar to each other, inconsistent spacing, and regional variations that made a manuscript copied in one place almost illegible in another. Think about what this meant practically. If a bishop in Spain received a letter from a bishop in Germany, he might struggle to read it simply because the letter forms were unfamiliar. If a monastery wanted to copy a manuscript borrowed from another institution, the scribe might have trouble deciphering it. And more seriously, texts accumulated errors as they were copied across regions, partly because scribes misread unfamiliar letter forms and reproduced what they thought they saw rather than what was actually there. Caroline minuscule solved these problems through standardization. It used distinct letter forms that were hard to confuse. The letters were smaller and more efficient than the monumental capitals or uncial letters used in earlier manuscripts, allowing more text on each page. Spaces between words became standard, making text immediately more readable. And the script had a beautiful clarity, a grace that came from its proportions and consistency. The script wasn't invented from nothing. It developed gradually, drawing on various earlier scripts, particularly those used in Northumbria and northern France. But under Alcuin's promotion and Charlemagne's authority, it became the standard script for the Carolingian Empire. Royal decrees went out stating that manuscripts should be copied in this script. Scriptoria were instructed to adopt it, scribes were trained in it, and slowly, over decades, Caroline minuscule spread across Western Europe. A monastery in Burgundy would receive a manuscript from Tours copied in this clear new script. The local scribes, seeing how much easier it was to read, would begin adopting it for their own work. Visiting scholars would bring the script back to their home institutions. Royal administrators, trained at Aachen or another Carolingian school, would use it in official documents. The script spread not through force, but through its obvious advantages, through the recognition that here was simply a better way to write. The impact went beyond mere convenience. Caroline minuscule helped create a common literate culture across Europe. It made the transmission of texts more reliable and efficient. It reduced copying errors. It allowed for the creation of more books because scribes could write more quickly. And perhaps most profoundly, it helped preserve classical and patristic texts that might otherwise have been lost, because those texts could now be copied more easily and accurately. Look at the letters you're reading right now if your eyes are still open. The lowercase letters on this screen or page are descendants of Caroline minuscule. The A and B and C we use today evolved from the letter forms that Carolingian scribes developed 1200 years ago. When Renaissance printers in the 15th century chose a typeface for their books, they looked to Carolingian manuscripts, which they thought were ancient Roman texts. They didn't realize they were copying a medieval script, but their choice meant that Caroline minuscule, slightly evolved, became the basis for modern European typography. There's something beautiful about this continuity, isn't there? Every time we write in lowercase letters, we're using a technology developed in Alcuin's scriptoria, refined by generations of Carolingian scribes, preserved through centuries because of its clarity and efficiency. We're connected directly to those medieval monks shivering in their writing rooms, carefully forming each letter with their goosequill pens. But the development of Caroline minuscule was only one part of the Carolingian effort to standardize and improve education. The script itself needed content to transmit, and that content needed to be organized and distributed through a network of institutions. The Carolingian reformers didn't just create a better way to write, they created a system for spreading that writing and the knowledge it contained across an entire empire, and that system was built on the monasteries, those islands of learning and preservation that would carry the Renaissance forward even after Charlemagne's empire fragmented. Let's turn our attention to these remarkable institutions and the network they formed. Monasteries had existed in Europe since late Roman times, communities of men or women dedicated to lives of prayer, work, and learning. But under Charlemagne and his successors, monasteries took on a new importance. They became the nodes in a network of education and cultural transmission, repositories of books and knowledge. Training grounds for the literate elite that the empire needed. The Benedictine rule, written by St. Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, governed most Western monasteries. It prescribed a balanced life of prayer, manual labour, and sacred reading. The hours of the day were divided between the divine office, the formal prayers said at regular intervals from before dawn until after dark, and work, which could mean farming or craft production, or, increasingly, scholarly work in the library and scriptorium. Charlemagne saw the potential in this network of monasteries. They already existed across his realm, from Italy to the North Sea, from the Atlantic to the borders of the Slavic lands. They had traditions of literacy and learning, however attenuated those might have become in some places. They had the infrastructure for education, buildings, books, teachers. They needed reform and support, certainly. But the foundation was there. The emperor issued a series of capitularies, royal decrees, that transformed the role of monasteries in his empire. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 was particularly important. It ordered that schools should be established in every monastery and cathedral, where boys could learn psalms, music, calculation and grammar. It commanded that books should be carefully corrected, not copied from corrupt exemplars. It insisted that monasteries maintain proper libraries and scriptoria. These weren't just suggestions. Charlemagne sent inspectors, called missi dominici, to visit monasteries and ensure compliance. Abbots who failed to maintain standards could be replaced. Monasteries that excelled might receive royal grants of land or privileges. The emperor made clear that he expected his monasteries to be centres of learning, not just of prayer. And the monasteries responded, though not all equally or immediately. Some great monasteries became renowned centres of scholarship. Tours, where Alcuin served as abbot in his later years, developed one of the finest libraries and scriptoria in Europe. Corbie in northern France produced magnificent manuscripts and trained generations of scribes. Fulda in Germany became a powerhouse of learning under Abbot Rabanus Maurus, who had studied with Alcuin, saint. Gaul in what is now Switzerland developed a distinctive intellectual culture and amassed an extraordinary library that still survives today. These monasteries didn't work in isolation. They formed a network connected by correspondence, by the lending of books, by the movement of monks and scholars between institutions. A young monk from Fulda might travel to Tours to study, then return home bringing new texts and ideas. A monastery that needed a particular text might write to another institution, asking to borrow it for copying. Scholars corresponded about theological questions, grammatical puzzles, textual problems. This network allowed knowledge to spread efficiently. A new text acquired in Italy could be copied and disseminated northward through the monastic network within a few years. Educational innovations developed at one monastery could be adopted by others. Questions could be referred to scholars at other institutions for expert answers. The network created a kind of collective intelligence, a shared scholarly culture that transcended regional boundaries. The monasteries also served another crucial function. They preserved texts through periods of instability. When Charlemagne's empire fragmented after his death, when Viking raids threatened northern monasteries, when political chaos made travel dangerous, the monastic libraries survived in many cases. Because texts had been copied and distributed across the network, the loss of one monastery's library didn't mean the loss of its texts. Other copies existed elsewhere, safeguarded by the redundancy that the network created. Think of it as an early form of distributed data storage. Instead of keeping a single precious copy of Virgil's Aeneid in one location, where fire or war or water damage could destroy it forever, the Carolingian network ensured that multiple copies existed in multiple locations. If one monastery's library was destroyed, the text could be restored from copies held elsewhere. But the network wasn't just about preservation, it was also about creation, about the intellectual work that happened when educated people could share ideas and challenge each other. The Carolingian period saw new works of history, theology, poetry, and commentary, written by scholars who were part of this network and who built on the foundation of classical and patristic learning that the scriptoria had preserved. Women's monasteries were part of this network too, though their role is sometimes overlooked. Houses like Chelles near Paris had scriptoria where nuns copied manuscripts, libraries where they could study, connections with other institutions. Some women became renowned scholars in their own right, though their achievements were often credited to men or simply forgotten by later generations, who couldn't imagine women as intellectual authorities. The monastic network that the Carolingian Renaissance strengthened would outlast the empire that created it. Through the 10th and 11th centuries, through the chaos of new invasions and political fragmentation, the monasteries remained. They continued copying manuscripts, teaching students, preserving learning. They became the foundation on which the later medieval intellectual revival would build, the cathedral schools and eventually the universities. And all of this rested on the reforms that Charlemagne and his scholars had implemented, the standards they had set, the network they had strengthened. But the network needed content, needed a common language that could be read and understood across the empire, and that meant reforming Latin itself. Which brings us to the next chapter in our story. When Alcuin arrived at Charlemagne's court, he encountered a problem that must have seemed almost insurmountable. Latin, the language of learning and administration, of scripture and liturgy, had fragmented into dozens of regional variants, many of which were barely mutually intelligible. This fragmentation had been happening for centuries. As the Roman Empire fell and populations became more isolated, the Latin spoken and written in different regions evolved in different directions. Local languages influenced pronunciation and vocabulary. Grammatical rules were forgotten or simplified. Spelling became inconsistent. By the 8th century, what was called Latin in one part of Europe might be nearly incomprehensible to someone from another region, and this mattered tremendously. Latin was supposed to be the universal language of the Church, the language in which the Mass was said, Scripture was read, theology was discussed. But if different regions used different versions of Latin, how could there be theological unity? How could bishops communicate? How could royal decrees be understood across the empire? Even more seriously, many clergy couldn't really understand the Latin they were using in worship. They had memorized the sounds of the liturgy but didn't know what the words meant. They mispronounced unfamiliar terms. They made grammatical errors that changed meanings. One bishop complained that some priests were baptizing children in nomine patria et filia, in the name of the fatherland and the daughter, instead of in nomine patris et filii, in the name of the Father and the Son. The mistake made the baptism invalid, at least technically, leaving the children unchristened through no fault of their own, but simply because of clerical ignorance. Alcuin and the other Carolingian reformers set out to fix this through education and standardization. They returned to classical Latin as their model, the Latin of Cicero and Virgil, of Augustine and Jerome. This was the language that had already been dead for centuries, in the sense that no one spoke it as a native tongue anymore. But it had the advantage of being stable, of having clear rules, of being the language in which the classical texts and church fathers had written. The reformers produced new grammar textbooks, or copied and corrected existing ones. Alcuin himself wrote a grammar that became widely used. These texts taught the parts of speech, the rules of declension and conjugation, the proper construction of sentences. They included exercises for students to practice. They emphasized correct spelling and pronunciation. But more than just teaching grammar, the reformers worked to make Latin a living language again, at least among the educated. At Aachen, scholars conversed in Latin, wrote letters in Latin, composed poetry in Latin. They created a culture in which using proper Latin was a mark of education and sophistication. And because these scholars went on to become bishops and abbots, royal councillors and teachers, they spread this reformed Latin throughout the empire. The standardization of Latin had profound effects. It meant that texts could be copied more accurately, with less corruption from scribes who didn't understand what they were copying. It meant that clergy could properly understand and perform the liturgy. It meant that royal administration could function more efficiently, with written orders that were clear and unambiguous. But there was also an unintended consequence, one that would have significant cultural implications. As Latin became more standardized and classical, it also became more obviously different from the Romance languages that people actually spoke in their daily lives. In Charlemagne's time, people in what is now France spoke a Proto-French that had evolved from Latin, but was no longer really the same language. Similarly, people in Italy spoke early Italian, people in Spain spoke early Spanish. Before the Carolingian reforms, there had been a kind of continuum between informal spoken Latin and formal written Latin. But as written Latin was reformed and standardized, as it became more consciously classical, that continuum broke. Latin became clearly a learned language, something you had to study formally, while the Romance vernaculars became clearly different languages suitable for daily life but not for formal writing. This split would eventually lead to the development of vernacular literature, to writing in French and Italian and Spanish. But that was still centuries away. In Charlemagne's time, Latin was reborn as the universal language of learning and administration, a common tongue that could unite a diverse empire. The reformed Latin also served as a vehicle for preserving classical learning. Because Carolingian scholars were studying classical Latin, they read classical authors. Because they were copying texts to learn correct Latin, they preserved those texts for posterity. Grammar and literature were intertwined. You couldn't learn one without the other. And there was beauty in this reformed Latin, a grace that came from its connection to the classical tradition. Carolingian writers learned to compose elegant prose and verse, to use rhetorical devices effectively, to express complex thoughts with precision. The language itself became a tool for thinking clearly and writing beautifully. It became a link to the Roman past, a way of claiming continuity with ancient wisdom, while building something new. And that link to the past was reflected in every aspect of Carolingian education, particularly in the curriculum they developed based on classical models, which we'll explore more deeply as our journey continues. The 7 liberal arts, that classical curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, had never entirely disappeared from medieval education. But by Charlemagne's time, they had become attenuated, taught incompletely if at all in most places. The Carolingian Renaissance brought them back, not just as subjects to be mentioned, but as a coherent program of education that shaped how educated people thought. We've already touched on the trivium, the language arts that form the foundation of education. But let's consider more deeply what studying these subjects meant in practice, and why they mattered so much to the Carolingian reformers. Grammar, as we've discussed, wasn't just about learning rules. It was about understanding how language worked, how meaning was constructed, how thought could be expressed precisely. Students spent years studying Latin grammar, not just memorizing paradigms, but analyzing texts, understanding why sentences were constructed in particular ways, developing a feel for the language's structure and beauty. This deep engagement with language-trained minds to think clearly and express thoughts precisely. Rhetoric built on this foundation, teaching students to persuade and communicate effectively. But Carolingian rhetoric wasn't just about winning arguments. It was also about understanding how different types of discourse worked, how to adapt your message to your audience, how to construct texts that achieved their intended purpose. Students learned to write different types of letters, to compose official documents, to create sermons and homilies. These were practical skills for future administrators and clergy, but they also cultivated a sophisticated understanding of how language functions in social and political contexts. Logic, the third member of the trivium, was perhaps the most abstract. Students learned to identify valid and invalid arguments, to recognize fallacies, to construct proofs. This training was essential for theology, for defending orthodox doctrine against heresy, for understanding Scripture and the Church Fathers. But it also cultivated a general ability to think rigorously, to distinguish good reasoning from bad, to approach problems methodically. The quadrivium, the mathematical arts, received less emphasis in most Carolingian schools, partly because teachers qualified to teach these subjects were rarer. But serious scholars did study these disciplines, and they were considered essential to a complete education. Arithmetic meant number theory more than calculation. Students learned about perfect numbers, prime numbers, the properties of odd and even. Numbers weren't just practical tools, but expressions of divine order. The universe was structured mathematically, and understanding numbers meant understanding something about God's creation. This wasn't mystical nonsense in their minds, but serious philosophy, rooted in Pythagorean and Platonic traditions that had been absorbed into Christian thought. Geometry involved the study of shapes, proportions, and measurements. It had practical applications in surveying, architecture, and engineering. Carolingian builders used geometric principles to design churches and palaces. But geometry also had theoretical importance. Euclid's Elements was studied, at least in part, as a model of logical reasoning and as an exploration of the mathematical principles underlying physical reality. Music theory was considered a mathematical discipline because it dealt with the ratios and proportions that governed musical intervals. Students learned about modes and scales, about the relationships between notes, about how music reflected cosmic harmony. They didn't necessarily learn to compose or perform music as part of this study, though many did. Rather, they learned to understand music as a manifestation of mathematical order, as another window into the structure of creation. Astronomy rounded out the quadrivium, teaching students about the movements of celestial bodies, the structure of the cosmos, the calculation of time and the calendar. This knowledge had practical importance for determining the date of Easter and other church festivals, which required understanding lunar cycles and the solar year. But astronomy also cultivated a sense of wonder at the universe's vastness and order, at the regular movements of stars and planets that revealed God's wisdom. Together, these 7 liberal arts formed a complete education. At least as the Carolingian reformers understood it, they weren't just random subjects, but a coherent program designed to train the mind, to cultivate understanding, to prepare students for deeper study of theology and philosophy. They were called liberal because they were suitable for free persons, as opposed to the mechanical arts or manual crafts. They were arts because they required skill and practice to master. The Carolingian commitment to this curriculum helped preserve classical learning. Because the liberal arts were taught, texts on these subjects had to be copied and studied. Boethius's works on arithmetic and music were transmitted, geometric treatises were preserved, rhetorical handbooks survived, and the curriculum itself became a model for medieval education, influencing cathedral schools and later universities. But perhaps most importantly, the liberal arts cultivated a particular kind of intellectual culture, one that valued learning for its own sake, that saw education as transformative, that believed knowledge of the created world could lead to knowledge of the Creator. This culture produced scholars who wrote commentaries and treatises, who asked questions and sought answers, who built on the foundations they had received. And that intellectual energy, that commitment to learning and inquiry, is what truly marks the Carolingian Renaissance as a renaissance, a rebirth of learning and culture. This rebirth wasn't just intellectual, though. It also manifested in the physical world, in the buildings and artworks that the Carolingians created, which we'll consider as our journey continues to unfold. The Carolingian Renaissance wasn't only about books and education. It also transformed the physical landscape of Europe through an ambitious program of building and architectural innovation. Charlemagne and his successors constructed churches, monasteries, and palaces that embodied their vision of a renewed Christian empire, and these buildings helped spread cultural and artistic standards across their realm. The palace complex at Aachen stands as the most impressive example of Carolingian architecture. Charlemagne chose Aachen as his primary residence partly for its hot springs, which he enjoyed, but also for its central location in his empire. Over several decades he built a palace complex there that rivaled anything seen in Western Europe since Roman times. The centrepiece was the Palatine Chapel, an octagonal church modelled on Byzantine architecture, particularly the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. The chapel was magnificent, with marble columns imported from Italy and Rome, bronze doors and railings cast in local workshops, mosaics decorating the dome, and a throne from which Charlemagne could observe services. The building made a statement. This Frankish emperor could command the resources and expertise to create something worthy of ancient Rome and contemporary Constantinople. But Aachen was more than just imperial grandeur. It was also functional, designed to house the administrative apparatus of the empire. There were halls for assemblies and feasts, quarters for the court and royal family, offices for administrators, a library and a scriptorium. The complex demonstrated that government could be organised and centred in one place, that written administration could support political power, that learning and culture could flourish under royal patronage. The architectural model of Aachen spread across the empire. Monasteries rebuilt their churches in grander styles, incorporating Carolingian innovations. At Centula in northern France, Abbot Angilbert oversaw the construction of a monastery with 3 churches arranged in a symbolic pattern. At Fulda, the monastery church was expanded and enriched. At St. Gall in Switzerland, a detailed architectural plan was drawn up showing an ideal monastery layout, complete with church, cloister, library, scriptorium, workshops, gardens, and farm buildings. This plan, which survives today, gives us an extraordinary window into how the Carolingians envisioned monastic life. These building programs required significant resources and expertise. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Timber had to be cut and seasoned. Skilled masons, carpenters, and other craftsmen had to be recruited or trained. Materials like marble and bronze had to be imported or recycled from Roman ruins. The costs were substantial, but Charlemagne and his successors were willing to invest in these projects because they understood that building served multiple purposes. Churches and monasteries were places of worship, certainly, but they were also statements of power and piety, demonstrations that the Carolingian rulers were worthy successors to the Christian emperors of Rome. They were investments in the church, securing divine favour and strengthening ties with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And they were cultural centres, housing libraries and schools, supporting scholarship and art. The architectural style that developed in this period was distinctive. Carolingian builders combined Roman elements, like basilica plans and classical columns, with newer features like westworks, those monumental west-facing entrances to churches that became characteristic of German Romanesque architecture. They experimented with vaulting and structural solutions to architectural problems. They created spacious interiors that could accommodate large congregations and elaborate liturgies. The decoration of these buildings was equally important. Carolingian artists created frescoes and mosaics, though most have been lost. They produced elaborate metalwork for altars and reliquaries. They designed stained glass, though again few examples survive. And they illuminated manuscripts with extraordinary skill, creating some of the most beautiful books ever made. Manuscript illumination deserves special mention because it combined art and learning in a particularly Carolingian way. The greatest Carolingian manuscripts weren't just texts, but works of art, with elaborate initials, decorative borders, and full-page illustrations. The Gospel books produced at Aachen and other centres show sophisticated artistic technique, combining Byzantine, insular, and classical Roman influences into something new and distinctive. These illuminated manuscripts served multiple purposes. They beautified the texts, making scripture and liturgical books worthy of their sacred content. They aided reading and comprehension through visual markers and decoration, and they demonstrated the skill and learning of their creators. showing that Carolingian culture could match or surpass anything produced in the past or in rival contemporary cultures. The building and artistic programs of the Carolingian Renaissance created a visual culture that supported and extended the educational and literary reforms. Beautiful buildings and books made learning attractive and important. They showed that Christianity and classical culture could be harmonized in stone and parchment. They created spaces where scholarship could flourish and be transmitted to new generations. And they left a physical legacy that endured even after the political structure of Charlemagne's empire collapsed. Many Carolingian buildings were rebuilt in later centuries, often in grander styles, so we've lost much of the original architectural legacy. But elements survived, influences persisted, and the ambition that these buildings represented, the vision of a Christian empire graced with learning and beauty, continued to inspire medieval builders and scholars, and that vision rested on the people who made it real. The scholars and artists who came from across Europe to participate in this cultural renewal. As we move into the next phase of our journey, we'll meet some of these remarkable individuals and understand the truly international character of the Carolingian Renaissance. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Carolingian Renaissance was its international character. Charlemagne didn't just reform education within his empire. He actively recruited scholars from across Europe and beyond, creating a truly cosmopolitan court of learning at Aachen. These scholars brought different traditions, different languages, different perspectives, and their interactions sparked intellectual creativity that enriched the entire enterprise. We've already met Alcuin, who came from York in Northumbria. But he was only the most famous of many foreign scholars who joined Charlemagne's court. From Italy came Peter of Pisa, a grammarian who taught Latin to Charlemagne himself and other members of the court. Also from Italy came Paul the Deacon, a Lombard historian and poet who had been educated at the Lombard court before it fell to Charlemagne. Paul brought knowledge of Lombard history and Italian literary traditions. From Ireland came scholars whose names we often don't know, but who brought the distinctive learning of Irish monasteries, which had preserved classical learning through their own path, somewhat independent of continental developments. Irish scholars were renowned for their knowledge of Greek, a rarity in the West at this time, and for their eccentric but brilliant approach to grammar and etymology. From Spain came Theodulf, who would become Bishop of Orleans. Theodulf was a Visigoth, educated in the sophisticated culture of Visigothic Spain, which had preserved more of classical learning than many other regions. He brought expertise in theology and classical poetry, and he became one of the most important poets and theologians of the Carolingian period. From Bavaria came other scholars, and from various Frankish monasteries and schools came homegrown talent that Alcuin and others trained and nurtured. The court at Aachen became a meeting place for the best minds of the age, a place where different intellectual traditions could encounter each other and cross-pollinate. These scholars didn't just teach and study in isolation, they formed a community, what they called the Palace Academy, though it wasn't an academy in any formal sense. They gave each other classical nicknames, playful but also serious acknowledgements of their roles and relationships. Alcuin was Horace, after the Roman poet. Charlemagne was David, after the biblical king. Theodulf was Pindar. These nicknames signified their participation in a community that saw itself as continuing and reviving classical traditions. The scholars debated theological questions, discussed grammatical problems, composed poetry for each other, wrote letters that circulated widely. These letters give us glimpses into their intellectual life, their friendships and rivalries, their shared commitment to learning. They asked each other riddles in verse, proposed complex exegetical problems, shared news about manuscripts they had discovered or copied. There was genuine intellectual ferment at Aachen, a sense that important things were happening, that learning was being revived and expanded. The scholars pushed each other to excellence, challenged each other's arguments, built on each other's insights. This kind of intensive scholarly community was rare in the early medieval period, and it produced results that individual scholars working in isolation could never have achieved. The international character of the court also meant that knowledge from different regions and traditions could be integrated. Irish grammatical theories could be tested against Italian rhetorical handbooks. Spanish theological interpretations could be debated with English biblical scholars. The best practices from different scriptoria could be compared and synthesized. This wasn't always smooth or easy. Different traditions sometimes conflicted, and scholars had to work out which approaches were most sound. But the diversity was strength, not weakness. It prevented intellectual stagnation, challenged assumptions, exposed scholars to new ideas and methods. And because these scholars then dispersed to positions across the empire, they carried this cosmopolitan intellectual culture with them, spreading it to monasteries and cathedral schools throughout Charlemagne's realm. The Palace Academy didn't last beyond Charlemagne's lifetime in its most vibrant form. Later Carolingian rulers maintained courts with scholarly presence, but never quite matched the brilliance of Charlemagne's gathering of minds. Yet the model persisted. The idea that a ruler should patronize learning, that scholars should gather and exchange ideas, that intellectual diversity enriched understanding. These concepts became embedded in medieval culture, and the scholars trained at Aachen went on to train others, creating a kind of intellectual genealogy that extended through the 9th century and beyond. Rabanus Maurus, who studied with Alcuin, became abbot of Fulda and one of the great teachers of his generation. His students included Walafrid Strabo and Servatus Lupus, who themselves became important scholars and teachers. This transmission of learning through personal relationships, teacher to student, created continuity and ensured that the Carolingian intellectual revival outlasted the specific individuals who had launched it, and what they transmitted included not just knowledge but specific texts, precious manuscripts that they worked so hard to preserve and that we must now consider more carefully. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Carolingian Renaissance was the preservation of classical Latin literature. Most of what survives from ancient Rome survives because Carolingian scribes copied it. This simple fact cannot be overstated. Without the Carolingian scriptoria, we would have lost most of Cicero, most of Virgil, most of Livy. The classical tradition that shaped Renaissance humanism, and through it modern Western culture, would have been far more fragmentary, perhaps irretrievably so. The preservation of classical texts wasn't inevitable or automatic. It required deliberate effort, significant resources, and sustained commitment across generations. It required that monasteries value these texts enough to devote precious parchment and scribal labour to copying them. It required that scholars see classical learning as worthy of preservation, not as pagan corruption to be rejected. The Carolingian attitude toward classical literature was complex. On one hand, these were pagan texts, written by non-Christians about pagan gods and values. Some early Christian thinkers had rejected classical learning entirely, seeing it as dangerous to Christian faith. On the other hand, the classical authors had achieved extraordinary eloquence and wisdom. They could teach grammar, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. And many church fathers, particularly Augustine and Jerome, had argued that Christians could appropriate what was valuable in pagan learning while rejecting what was false or immoral. The Carolingian scholars generally followed this Augustinian approach. They valued classical texts as tools for education, as models of Latin style, as sources of historical and philosophical knowledge. They taught Virgil in schools because his poetry was beautiful and because studying it improved students' Latin. They copied Cicero's rhetorical works because these taught how to write and speak effectively. They preserved Livy's history because it provided knowledge of Rome's past. But they were also selective. Some classical texts were considered too immoral or too dangerous to copy. We know that some works were available in the 9th century, but not copied frequently enough to survive. Other texts we know only from mentions in ancient sources but have no surviving manuscripts. The Carolingian filter determined what would survive and what would be lost. The process of preservation was laborious. A monastery would need to acquire an exemplar, either by borrowing from another institution or by receiving a gift or purchase. The exemplar might be damaged, with missing pages or faded text. It might be written in an older, difficult-to-read script. It might contain errors from previous copying. A skilled scribe would then begin the work of copying, comparing the exemplar carefully, trying to produce an accurate reproduction. If multiple exemplars were available, scholars might collate them, comparing readings to identify errors and restore the original text where possible. This textual criticism was primitive by modern standards, but it was real and significant. Some Carolingian scriptoria specialized in particular authors or genres. Tours became known for excellent copies of Livy's history. Corby produced important manuscripts of classical poetry. These scriptoria didn't just copy mechanically. They worked to produce accurate, beautiful editions that could serve as new exemplars for other monasteries. The preservation effort was comprehensive. The Carolingians copied poetry and prose, history and philosophy, scientific and technical works. They preserve Virgil's Aeneid, Georgics and Eclogues, those foundational texts of Latin poetry. They copied Ovid's Metamorphoses, though his more erotic poetry was less frequently copied. They preserved Horace's Odes and Satires, Juvenal's Satires, Statius's Thebaid. These weren't just copied once, but multiple times, creating redundancy that helped ensure survival. In prose, they copied Cicero extensively, his rhetorical works, his philosophical dialogues, his letters. They preserved Caesar's Gallic Wars, Sallust's historical works, and portions of Livy's massive history of Rome, though much of Livy was already lost by the 9th century and couldn't be recovered. They copied Pliny's Natural History, that vast encyclopedia of ancient knowledge. They preserved Seneca's philosophical essays, Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, and numerous other works. Some of these texts existed in only a single Carolingian manuscript, or in just a handful. If those manuscripts had been lost, the texts would have vanished. Think about that for a moment. The survival of works that have shaped Western culture for over 1,000 years depended on a few parchment codices, on whether a particular monastery library survived fire or flood or Viking raids, on whether later generations valued those texts enough to copy them again. We owe an immense debt to the Carolingian scribes who made this preservation possible. They didn't do it for us, of course. They couldn't have imagined us. They did it because they valued learning, because they believed education required access to these texts, because they thought preserving knowledge was a worthy use of their lives. But their labour saved the classical tradition for posterity, passing it on through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and modernity. The irony is that Renaissance humanists, rediscovering these classical texts in medieval manuscripts, sometimes scorned the Middle Ages as a dark age of ignorance. They didn't realise, or didn't acknowledge, that the texts they treasured had survived precisely because medieval monks had copied them with such dedication. Without the Carolingian Renaissance, there would have been far less for the Italian Renaissance to revive, and that gives us a deeper appreciation for what Charlemagne and his scholars achieved. Not just a temporary flourishing, but a permanent enrichment of Western culture. But their concern wasn't only with classical texts. They also worked to spread education more broadly, to create schools where the next generation could learn, which brings us to consider how these educational reforms extended beyond the palace and the great monasteries. When we think of the Carolingian Renaissance, we tend to picture men, Charlemagne and his court, Alcuin and the other scholars, monks labouring in scriptoria. This picture isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Women also participated in Carolingian intellectual life, though their contributions have often been minimised or forgotten by later historians who couldn't imagine women as scholars and scribes. The evidence for women's scholarly activity is fragmentary, partly because women's accomplishments were less likely to be recorded, partly because later copyists sometimes removed women's names from works or attributed their writings to men. But enough evidence survives to show that women were active in education, manuscript production, and intellectual work throughout the Carolingian period. Women's monasteries or convents were centres of female education and learning. Houses like Chelles near Paris, Remiremont in the Vosges, Hereford in Saxony, and many others maintained schools where girls from aristocratic families could be educated. The curriculum was similar to that in male institutions: Latin grammar and reading, religious texts, sometimes music and calculation. Some convents had substantial libraries and active scriptoria where nuns copied manuscripts. At Chelles, the abbess Gisela, Charlemagne's sister, oversaw a community that produced manuscripts and maintained correspondence with scholars elsewhere. The convent scriptorium created beautiful illuminated manuscripts, and its nuns were clearly literate in Latin. Other convents similarly contributed to the preservation and transmission of texts. Some individual women achieved notable learning. Duoda, a Frankish noblewoman, wrote a manual of instruction for her son around 841. This work, the Liber Manualis, shows sophisticated knowledge of Scripture and the Church Fathers, competent Latin composition, and serious theological and moral reasoning. Duoda wasn't a professional scholar, just an educated laywoman, yet her work demonstrates what women could achieve with access to education. Hildegard, though she lived later in the 12th century, had predecessors in the Carolingian period. Women who experienced visions, wrote theological works, corresponded with male scholars and rulers. Some of these Carolingian women are known only from brief mentions in letters or chronicles, their names preserved but their works lost. Female scribes existed, though identifying them is difficult. Some manuscripts contain colophons mentioning women by name, asking for prayers for the scribe. Other evidence suggests women's involvement in book production, references in letters to nuns who were skilled in writing, artwork in manuscripts that might have been produced by women, grammatical forms in scribal notes that indicate female authorship. The scale of women's involvement in manuscript production is debated among historians. Some argue that women were frequently involved in copying texts, but that their work was unacknowledged or attributed to men. Others suggest that female scribes were rare, exceptions that prove the rule. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Women could and did participate in manuscript production, especially in convents, but they were a minority of scribes overall, and their work was less likely to be signed or acknowledged. Women also served as patrons of learning, using their wealth and influence to support scholars and fund the production of manuscripts. Queens and princesses commissioned books, endowed monasteries, sponsored schools. This patronage was crucial to the expansion of Carolingian learning, but is often overlooked in favour of male patronage. Education for women had practical limits in Carolingian society. Women couldn't become priests, so theological education for liturgical purposes was less relevant for them. Women couldn't hold most positions in royal administration, limiting the practical applications of legal and political education, and social expectations generally confined women to domestic and religious spheres, reducing opportunities for intellectual work to have public impact. But within these constraints, women created spaces for learning and intellectual activity. Convents became refuges where women could devote themselves to study and writing without the demands of marriage and motherhood. Female communities developed their own intellectual cultures, though we know frustratingly little about them because the sources are so sparse. The contributions of Carolingian women to the preservation of learning shouldn't be idealized or exaggerated, but neither should they be erased. Women were part of the story, participants in the revival of education and the preservation of texts. Their absence from most historical accounts reflects later historians' biases more than historical reality. And there's something poignant about recovering these women from historical obscurity, acknowledging their presence in scriptoria and schools, recognizing that the Carolingian Renaissance was not exclusively male. It reminds us that history is always incomplete, always shaped by what was recorded and what was considered worthy of recording. It encourages us to read sources with skepticism, to ask who might be missing from the narrative. to look for traces of people whose contributions were marginalised. The Carolingian women who learned Latin, who copied manuscripts, who wrote letters and treatises, who taught younger women, who patronised scholarship, they too were part of the revival of learning. They too helped preserve the texts and traditions that would shape medieval and modern culture. Their work was quieter, less celebrated, often anonymous. But it was real and it mattered. And alongside the written word they helped preserve, there was also visual beauty, the art of illumination and decoration that made Carolingian manuscripts treasures not just of scholarship, but of aesthetic achievement, which invites us to consider the artistic dimension of this Renaissance. The Carolingian Renaissance was not only a revival of learning, but also a flourishing of visual arts, particularly the art of manuscript illumination. The most beautiful books produced in the 8th and 9th centuries combined religious devotion, classical influence, and artistic innovation to create works that are still breathtaking today. Illumination, in the medieval sense, meant decorating manuscripts with gold and bright colours. The term comes from the use of gold leaf, which seemed to make pages glow with light. But illumination encompassed much more than just gilding. Elaborate initial letters, decorative borders, full-page illustrations, intricate patterns, and figures both human and divine. The Carolingian approach to illumination drew on multiple artistic traditions. From Byzantium came certain iconographic conventions and a love of gold and rich colours. From the insular tradition of Ireland and Northumbria came complex interlace patterns and decorative initials. From classical Roman art came naturalistic figure drawing and architectural elements. Carolingian artists synthesized these influences into something new and distinctive, the Gospel. Books produced at Charlemagne's court represent the highest achievement of Carolingian illumination. Books like the Lorsch Gospels, the Coronation Gospels, and the Ada Gospels combined exquisite craftsmanship with theological significance. These weren't just beautiful objects, but sacred texts, vessels for the Word of God, and their decoration reflected and enhanced their spiritual importance. Consider the Coronation Gospels, produced at Aachen around 800. The evangelists are portrayed as classical authors, seated at desks with scrolls and books, their robes flowing in realistic folds, their faces showing individual character. The style deliberately evokes late Roman manuscript illumination, claiming continuity with ancient Christian art. The purple-dyed parchment and gold ink make the book shimmer with imperial splendour. Or consider the Ada Gospels, named after a nun mentioned in its dedication. Each Gospel begins with a full-page portrait of the evangelist, surrounded by elaborate architectural frames that recall classical Roman painting. The figures are solid and three-dimensional, quite different from the flatter, more abstract figures in earlier medieval art. The colours are rich, deep purples, bright reds, lustrous golds. The whole effect is one of magnificence and dignity. The production of these illuminated manuscripts required multiple skilled specialists. Someone had to prepare the parchment, scraping and smoothing animal skins to create pristine writing surfaces. Someone had to mix the inks and paints from minerals and plants, creating the vivid colours that have lasted 12 centuries. A scribe would write the text in beautiful Caroline minuscule. Then illuminators would add the decoration, working with gold leaf, painting elaborate initials and borders, creating the full-page miniatures. This was collaborative art, though we rarely know the names of the artists involved. Medieval artists generally didn't sign their work as individuals would centuries later. The glory was to go to God and the institution, not to the artist. But occasionally we glimpse names: Diodoricus, Luthard, and others mentioned in colophons or dedications. The iconography in these manuscripts was rich with meaning. The four evangelists were often represented by their traditional symbols: the winged man for Matthew, the lion for Mark, the ox for Luke, the eagle for John. These symbols derive from Ezekiel's vision and Revelation's 4 living creatures, connected to the evangelists by early Christian interpretation. Carolingian artists depicted them in various ways, sometimes just the symbols, sometimes the evangelists with their symbols, sometimes elaborate scenes combining multiple elements. Beyond the Gospel books, other types of manuscripts received illumination. Psalters, the books of Psalms used for prayer, might have decorated initials at significant divisions. Sacramentaries, books containing the prayers for Mass, might have ornate pages for major feasts. Even non-religious texts might receive decoration. Grammar books might have decorated initials. Classical texts might have author portraits. The artistic excellence of Carolingian illumination served multiple purposes. It honoured sacred texts by adorning them with beauty and precious materials. It aided devotion by providing visual focal points for meditation. It demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the patron or institution that commissioned the manuscript, and it simply brought beauty into a world where beautiful objects were rare. But there's also something more subtle happening in these illuminated manuscripts, a conversation between text and image, between word and visual representation. The decorations weren't just pretty additions, but interpretations of the text, visual theology that guided how readers understood what they were reading. An image of Christ in majesty above the beginning of a gospel establishes the divine authority of what follows. A depiction of the evangelist writing shows inspiration and transmission of sacred truth. This integration of text and image would have long-lasting influence on Western art and culture. The tradition of manuscript illumination would continue through the Middle Ages, reaching new heights in the Gothic period with works like the Book of Kells and the Trechische Uhr. But the Carolingian period established many of the conventions and demonstrated that Christian art could match or exceed the artistic achievements of the pagan classical world. The survival of these illuminated manuscripts is itself miraculous. Many were lost to fire, war, theft, and simple decay. Others were broken up for their valuable materials, their parchment reused, their gold leaf scraped off. But enough survived to give us a sense of Carolingian artistic achievement, preserved in libraries and museums where they still glow with colour and gold, still inspire wonder at the skill and devotion of their creators. And as we move forward in our journey, we'll discover how all these elements, the learning and the art, the schools and the scriptoria, came together to create a cultural renewal that extended beyond Charlemagne's lifetime, shaping the development of European civilization in profound and lasting ways. Charlemagne died in 814, leaving his empire to his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a capable ruler and a genuinely devout Christian, but he lacked his father's political skill and military prowess, and he faced a problem that would prove insurmountable: how to divide the empire among his own sons while maintaining its unity. Frankish tradition called for dividing inheritances among all legitimate male heirs, but Charlemagne's empire was too large and too diverse to be easily divided. Moreover, Louis had taken the title of emperor seriously, seeing it as indivisible just as the Roman Empire had been indivisible. But he had 3 surviving sons by his first wife, and custom demanded that they receive inheritances. Louis attempted various solutions, issuing successive plans for dividing the empire, but each plan dissatisfied someone, and his sons began jockeying for position, forming alliances and rebelling against their father. When Louis married again and had another son, Charles, the situation became even more complicated. The older sons resented this new competitor for their inheritance. The conflict culminated after Louis's death in 840. His 3 surviving sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, fought a brief but brutal civil war. The decisive battle was fought at Fontenoy in June 841, a bloody engagement that contemporaries described with horror. Frankish armies had fought each other before, but the scale and savagery of Fontenoy shocked people accustomed to wars against external enemies. Eventually, the brothers reached a settlement, the Treaty of Verdun, signed in August 843. This treaty divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 kingdoms. Lothair, the oldest, received the Middle Kingdom, a strip of territory running from the North Sea through the Low Countries, Burgundy, and into Italy. He kept the imperial title, though it now meant little. Louis the German received the eastern portion, roughly corresponding to modern Germany. Charles the Bald received the western portion, roughly corresponding to modern France. This division had enormous long-term consequences. It created the basic shape of medieval and early modern Europe, the division between France and Germany that would define European politics for over a millennium. The Middle Kingdom, Lothair's portion, would be fought over for centuries, eventually fragmenting into multiple smaller territories. Lotharingia, Burgundy, northern Italy, the Low Countries. But what did this political fragmentation mean for the cultural renaissance that Charlemagne had initiated? The answer is complex and somewhat surprising. In some ways, the division threatened the educational and cultural reforms. Without a single powerful emperor to enforce standards, to fund monasteries, to promote education, there was a risk that the gains would be lost, that local regions would slide back into isolation and ignorance. And indeed, the later 9th century saw new challenges that threatened learning. Viking raids from Scandinavia intensified, targeting monasteries particularly because they were wealthy and poorly defended. Libraries were burned, manuscripts were destroyed, communities of scholars were scattered. In 845, Vikings sacked Paris. In 881, they destroyed the monastery at Corbie. Countless smaller monasteries suffered similar fates. Magyar invasions from the east similarly disrupted learning and monastic life. Arab raiders from North Africa and Spain attacked coastal areas. Internal political conflicts and wars created further instability. The period from about 850 to 950 is sometimes called the Second Dark Age, though this label is probably too harsh. Yet the Carolingian cultural achievement proved surprisingly resilient. The schools and scriptoria that had been established continued functioning, or were rebuilt if destroyed. The standards for education and literacy that had been set remained as ideals that institutions tried to meet. The manuscripts that had been copied existed in multiple locations, so the destruction of one monastery's library didn't mean the loss of its texts. Moreover, the division of the empire meant that cultural competition among the successor kingdoms could promote learning. Each ruler wanted to show that his kingdom was the true heir to Charlemagne's legacy. One way to demonstrate this was through patronage of education and culture. Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald all saw themselves as continuing their grandfather's work, and they supported scholarship even as they fought each other politically. The network of monasteries and cathedral schools that had been created under Charlemagne continued to function across the divided empire. Scholars still travelled between institutions, sharing manuscripts and ideas. Letters still circulated widely. Intellectual life continued, though perhaps less intensively than in Charlemagne's time, and new centres of learning emerged. In the Eastern Kingdom, monasteries like Reichenau and St. Gall became increasingly important. In the Western Kingdom, centres like Reims and Leon developed strong educational programmes. In Italy, which remained more connected to Byzantine and Mediterranean culture, distinctive intellectual traditions developed. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't end abruptly with the Treaty of Verdun. Instead, it transformed, becoming more diffuse, but also more deeply rooted in multiple centres, rather than dependent on a single court. The cultural renewal that Charlemagne had initiated took on a life of its own, persisting and evolving even as the political structure that had launched it fragmented. And this persistence across generations, this transmission of learning from teacher to student, monastery to monastery, century to century, reveals the true depth of what had been achieved, which invites us to consider how the legacy extended beyond Charlemagne's lifetime. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't end with Charlemagne's death in 814, nor even with the division of his empire in 843. The cultural renewal he had initiated continued through the 9th century and beyond, carried forward by scholars who had been trained in the Carolingian system and who trained the next generation in turn. One of the most important of these second-generation Carolingian scholars was Rabanus Maurus, who had studied under Alcuin at Tours and became abbot of Fulda in 822. Rabanus transformed Fulda into one of Europe's great centres of learning, overseeing the expansion of its library, the improvement of its scriptorium, the strengthening of its school. Rabanus wrote extensively on biblical interpretation, composed poetry, created an encyclopedia called De Universo that attempted to compile all knowledge worth knowing. He trained numerous students who would become important scholars and teachers themselves, spreading Carolingian educational ideals throughout the German lands. When he later became Archbishop of Mainz, he continued his scholarly work while also serving as a church leader, demonstrating that learning and administration could be combined. Walafrid Strabo, one of Rabanus's students, became abbot of Reichenau and wrote important biblical commentaries and poetry. His work shows sophisticated knowledge of classical literature and patristic theology, all filtered through the Carolingian educational program. Walafrid's writings were widely copied and read, influencing medieval biblical interpretation for centuries. Servatus Lupus, another of Rabanus's students, became abbot of Ferrières and was perhaps the finest classical scholar of the 9th century. Lupus's letters reveal him corresponding with other scholars across Europe, borrowing manuscripts, discussing textual problems, working to improve the texts of classical authors. He exemplified the Carolingian commitment to both preserving and correcting ancient texts, not just copying them mechanically, but trying to restore them to accuracy. In the Western Kingdom, John Scotus Eriugena stands out as a uniquely brilliant and somewhat eccentric scholar. Eriugena was Irish, trained in the distinctive Irish intellectual tradition, and he brought knowledge of Greek that was rare in 9th century Europe. He translated works by Greek church fathers into Latin, making them available to Western scholars. And he wrote his own philosophical works, attempting to synthesize Christian theology with Neoplatonic philosophy in ways that would influence later medieval thought. These scholars and others like them carried the Carolingian Renaissance into the later 9th century. They trained students, copied manuscripts, wrote new works, maintained the educational standards that had been established. They adapted to changing political circumstances, serving new rulers and kingdoms, but maintaining intellectual connections across political boundaries. The later 9th and early 10th centuries saw challenges that tested the resilience of Carolingian culture. Viking invasions were particularly destructive, targeting monasteries for their portable wealth and disrupting the communities that had sustained learning. Some monasteries were destroyed entirely. Others saw their communities scattered, their libraries damaged or destroyed, their schools closed. But many monasteries survived, or were rebuilt. The network of institutions that had been created provided redundancy and resilience. Texts that existed in multiple libraries couldn't be completely destroyed. Educational traditions that had been transmitted to multiple centres could survive the loss of any single centre. And the commitment to learning that had been instilled in multiple generations of scholars persisted even through difficult times. By the end of the 9th century, the Carolingian Empire as a political entity had effectively ceased to exist, fragmented into multiple kingdoms and territories. But the cultural and educational legacy of the Carolingian Renaissance continued. The reformed Latin that Alcuin had promoted remained the standard language of learning. The Caroline minuscule that Carolingian scribes had developed remained the standard script. The educational curriculum based on the liberal arts remained the model for medieval schools. Cathedral schools began to take on greater importance in the 10th and early 11th centuries, particularly in the Western Kingdom, where they would eventually give rise to universities. These schools built directly on Carolingian foundations, teaching the same curriculum, using the same texts, following the same educational philosophy that had been established in the 8th and 9th centuries. The Ottoman Renaissance in 10th century Germany represented another flowering of culture that drew directly on Carolingian precedents. The Ottoman emperors saw themselves as heirs to Charlemagne, and they promoted learning and culture in conscious imitation of his example. Ottoman scriptoria produced magnificent manuscripts. Ottoman schools trained scholars. Ottoman rulers patronized learning. Similarly, the cultural renewal in 11th century France and the Norman kingdoms drew on Carolingian foundations. The reform movements in the church, the new theological and philosophical work, the expansion of education, all built on what the Carolingian Renaissance had established. The persistence of this legacy suggests that the Carolingian achievement was not just a temporary flourishing dependent on one extraordinary ruler, but a fundamental transformation of European culture. Something had changed permanently in how knowledge was valued, how it was transmitted, how it was preserved. The infrastructure of learning, the schools and scriptoria and libraries, the community of scholars, the commitment to education. These things endured because they had been built into the fabric of medieval society. And that leads us to consider what was saved and what was lost in this great project of preservation and renewal. Looking back across the centuries, we can assess what the Carolingian Renaissance saved and what it couldn't save, what texts survived and what vanished, what knowledge was preserved and what was lost forever. It's a mixed record, remarkable in its successes but also poignant in its failures. On the positive side, the Carolingians preserved the core of classical Latin literature. Most of what survives from ancient Rome survives because Carolingian scribes copied it in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries. This includes most of Cicero's works, most of Virgil, significant portions of other major authors. Without the Carolingian effort, we would have lost much of the foundation of Western literary and philosophical tradition. They also preserved crucial patristic works, the writings of the Church Fathers that defined Christian theology and practice. Augustine's work survived almost entirely, copied repeatedly in Carolingian scriptoria. Jerome's biblical translations and commentaries were preserved. Ambrose, Gregory the Great, and other Latin fathers survived through Carolingian copying. These texts shaped medieval Christianity, and through it Western Christianity more broadly. Biblical texts were preserved and standardized. The Carolingians worked to create accurate versions of Scripture, correcting errors that had accumulated through centuries of copying. The Latin Vulgate Bible that they produced became the standard biblical text for Western Christianity for over a millennium, until the Reformation and Counter-Reformation produced new translations. Scientific and technical texts survived, though less completely than literary and theological works. Some ancient mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy was preserved. Medical texts survived. Agricultural treatises were copied. This knowledge would be built upon in the later Middle Ages, contributing to eventual scientific advancement. But there were also significant losses. Many classical Greek works were not available in Latin translation, and since few Carolingian scholars knew Greek well, these works couldn't be preserved. Most of Greek tragedy is lost. Most of Greek lyric poetry vanished. Large portions of Greek philosophy, history, and science survived only because they were later transmitted through Arabic or Byzantine sources, not through the Carolingian West. Even in Latin, much was lost. Most of Roman history doesn't survive. We have only a tiny fraction of the works that ancient Roman libraries held. Livy's massive history of Rome, for example, was 142 books long originally. Only 35 books survive, the rest lost before the Carolingian period, or because they weren't copied frequently enough during it. Pagan religious texts were particularly likely to be lost. The Carolingians were selective in what they preserved, and texts that seemed to promote pagan religion, rather than just recording pagan culture, were often not copied. We've lost most of Roman religious literature as a result. Some genres were neglected. Ancient novels, for example, mostly disappeared. Love poetry was sometimes considered too racy, and was copied less frequently. Scientific works that contradicted Christian doctrine might be ignored or even deliberately suppressed. And there was simple randomness. A manuscript might be lost to fire or water damage or mould. A monastery's library might be destroyed in a raid. A text might exist in only 1 or 2 copies, and if both were lost, the text vanished forever. We know of many lost works only because they're mentioned in surviving texts, quotations from books that no longer exist. The process of preservation was also selective geographically. Carolingian scriptoria were concentrated in certain regions, northeastern France, the Rhineland, northern Italy. Texts that existed in libraries in these regions were more likely to be copied and preserved. Texts that existed only in peripheral regions might be lost simply because they weren't available to the major scriptoria. Language played a role too. The Carolingian Renaissance was focused on Latin. Texts in other languages, even other European languages, were rarely copied or preserved. Most Old English literature, for example, survives in only 1 or a few manuscripts, many created later in England rather than in Carolingian scriptoria. Irish literature in Old Irish was preserved by Irish institutions, not by Carolingian ones. But perhaps the most poignant losses are the texts we don't know about, the works that vanish so completely that we don't even have references to them, anonymous voices silenced forever. How many poets wrote verses that delighted their contemporaries but were never copied and so disappeared? How many philosophers developed ideas that died with them because they weren't written down or preserved? We can only guess. Despite these losses, the Carolingian achievement in preservation was remarkable. They saved enough to maintain continuity with the classical past, to provide raw material for later medieval and Renaissance scholarship, to preserve the foundation of Western literary and intellectual tradition. And they didn't just preserve texts mechanically. They also transmitted understanding, teaching people how to read and interpret these texts, how to value and use them. The texts they saved became the curriculum of medieval education, the foundation of medieval theology and philosophy, the models for medieval literature. The classical authors that the Carolingians copied were read and studied throughout the Middle Ages, influencing everything from poetry to political theory to science. And when Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical learning, they were really rediscovering what Carolingian monks had saved, reading in Renaissance libraries the very manuscripts that Carolingian scribes had copied centuries earlier. We owe them an immense debt. But that debt becomes even more profound when we consider the human cost of this achievement, the enormous effort required to preserve and transmit knowledge, which brings us to reflect on what it actually took to accomplish what they did. Behind the statistics and the manuscripts, behind the schools and the learned treatises, were human beings who devoted their lives to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The Carolingian Renaissance wasn't achieved by abstract forces or historical inevitability. It was achieved by individuals making daily choices to value learning over immediate comfort, to prioritize preservation over personal advancement, to teach patiently when they might have done easier things. Consider the life of a typical scribe in a Carolingian monastery. He rises before dawn for matins, the first prayer service of the day. After prayers, perhaps some breakfast. Then into the scriptorium for hours of copying. His hand cramps, his back aches from hunching over the writing desk, his eyes strain in the dim light. In winter his fingers go numb with cold. He's copying a classical text, perhaps Cicero's De Inventione. The Latin is sometimes obscure. The exemplar he's working from has errors and damaged sections. He must concentrate intensely, understanding what he reads well enough to correct obvious errors, maintaining consistent letter forms and spacing, avoiding mistakes that would waste precious parchment and require laborious correction. After several hours, he takes a break for the next prayer service. Then back to work. More copying, more concentration, more physical discomfort. Eventually a simple meal, more prayer, perhaps some free time for personal study or rest. Then evening prayers as the light fails, then sleep, and tomorrow it starts again. This was his life, day after day, year after year. One manuscript might take weeks or months to complete. Major works might require multiple scribes working together for extended periods. The physical toll was real. Scribes developed repetitive strain injuries. Their eyesight deteriorated. They suffered from headaches and backaches. Some of the colophons they left at the ends of manuscripts express relief at completion. The end of the book, thanks be to God. Yet they persevered. Why? Partly from duty. Copying manuscripts was holy work, preserving God's word and the wisdom of the fathers, but also from a sense of participating in something larger than themselves. They were links in a chain of transmission stretching back to antiquity and forward to unknown future generations. They were preserving light against darkness, knowledge against ignorance. Teachers in Carolingian schools faced their own challenges. Many had to work with students who arrived barely literate, knowing only rudimentary Latin if that. These teachers had to drill grammar endlessly, explain basic concepts repeatedly, maintain discipline and motivation in students who might not initially see the value of what they were learning. The rewards were often not immediate. A teacher might work for years before seeing a student truly grasp the material and go on to become a scholar in his own right. The satisfaction came from rare moments of breakthrough. When a difficult concept finally made sense to a struggling student, or when a particularly promising student began to ask sophisticated questions that showed real understanding. Alcuin himself, the architect of so much Carolingian educational reform, spent years at Aachen away from his home in Northumbria, far from the library and students he knew well. Working in a foreign culture with unfamiliar students, he was past middle age when he took on this challenge. He could have stayed in York in comfort and respect. Instead, he chose the difficult work of building something new, of creating educational infrastructure in a realm that desperately needed it, but didn't always appreciate the effort required. The scholars who travelled between institutions, spreading learning and manuscripts, faced physical danger and discomfort. Medieval travel was slow and dangerous. Roads were poor. Bandits were a real threat. Weather could make journeys miserable or impossible. Yet scholars travelled anyway, carrying precious manuscripts across hundreds of miles, spending weeks or months away from home to consult another library or deliver a text. The abbots and bishops who oversaw schools and scriptoria had to balance competing demands. They needed to maintain economic viability for their institutions, managing estates, and protecting monastic independence. They needed to perform liturgical and pastoral duties. They needed to navigate political complexities, maintaining good relationships with rulers while protecting institutional autonomy. And they needed to promote learning, allocating resources to education and book production, even when other needs seemed more pressing. There was also intellectual struggle. Learning classical Latin to a high level of proficiency was genuinely difficult. Mastering the liberal arts curriculum required years of study. Understanding complex theological and philosophical arguments demanded serious mental effort. Not everyone succeeded. Many students dropped out or achieved only basic literacy. Many teachers faced frustration with their own limitations and their students' struggles. And there was the constant awareness of how much had been lost, how fragmented and corrupt the texts they were trying to preserve had become. Carolingian scholars knew they were working with imperfect materials, trying to restore and preserve knowledge that had already suffered centuries of damage and neglect. The scope of the task must have sometimes seemed overwhelming, yet they kept working, generation after generation, monastery after monastery, scribe after scribe. They copied manuscripts, they taught students, they wrote commentaries and original works. They built and maintained the infrastructure of learning. They did this not because it was easy or immediately rewarding, but because they believed it mattered, because they valued knowledge and education and cultural continuity. We are the beneficiaries of their effort. Every time we read Virgil or Cicero, we're reading what they preserved. Every time we use lowercase letters, we're using their script. Every time we structure education around liberal arts, we're following their model. We owe them more than we usually acknowledge, these anonymous monks and scholars who worked in cold scriptoria 1200 years ago, preserving the light of learning so it could be passed on to us. And that light, carefully preserved and transmitted, created a legacy that shaped not just one generation, but the entire future of Western civilization, which leads us to consider the full scope of what they accomplished. When Charlemagne became sole ruler of the Franks in 771, he inherited a kingdom that was militarily powerful but culturally impoverished. By the time he died in 814, he had transformed not just his kingdom, but the entire character of Western European civilization. The change wasn't accomplished through military conquest alone, though that was important. It came through a deliberate, sustained effort to promote learning and education, to preserve and transmit knowledge, to create infrastructure that would outlast his reign. It's worth pausing to consider how unusual this was. Most medieval rulers focused on military power, territorial expansion, and dynastic survival. They might patronize the church from piety or political calculation, but they rarely made education and culture central priorities. Charlemagne did both. He conquered territories and he founded schools. He defeated enemies and he promoted literacy. He expanded his realm and he established scriptoria. This dual focus on power and learning reflected Charlemagne's own character. His unusual combination of martial prowess and intellectual curiosity. He was a successful warrior who never fully learned to write but who loved having books read to him. He was a practical politician who valued abstract learning. He was a Christian ruler who saw preserving pagan classical texts as compatible with religious devotion. But Charlemagne's vision alone wouldn't have accomplished anything without the people who implemented it. Alcuin and the other scholars who came to his court, who created the curriculum and established the schools, the scribes who copied manuscripts in cold scriptoria, the teachers who drilled Latin grammar into resistant students, the abbots and bishops who built libraries and supported education, the political administrators who used writing to make government more efficient. All of these people, motivated by their own reasons but aligned around a common project, made the Carolingian Renaissance real. The vision that drove this project was essentially conservative, to restore what had been lost, to recover the learning and literacy of late antiquity, to rebuild what had crumbled since Rome's fall. Charlemagne and his scholars weren't trying to create something entirely new, but to revive what they imagined the past had been. Yet in that process of recovery and restoration, they did create something new, a specifically medieval learned culture that synthesized classical learning, Christian theology, and contemporary needs. This synthesis would shape European civilization for centuries. The educational model they established would be followed by medieval schools and universities. The texts they preserved would be studied throughout the Middle Ages and rediscovered with enthusiasm in the Renaissance. The script they developed would evolve into our modern lowercase letters. The standardized Latin they promoted would remain the international language of learning until the modern period. The architectural and artistic styles they developed would influence later medieval art. But perhaps most importantly, they established the principle that culture and learning mattered, that knowledge was worth preserving, that education was valuable even beyond its immediate practical applications. This wasn't obvious or inevitable. Medieval society could have developed without this emphasis on learning. Many civilizations have been powerful and sophisticated without high literacy rates or extensive formal education. The Carolingians made a choice to value these things, and that choice had lasting consequences. Think about what might have been lost if the Carolingian Renaissance hadn't happened. How many classical texts would have disappeared entirely without 9th century copying? Would anyone in later centuries have been able to recover enough of the classical tradition to launch a Renaissance? Would medieval theology and philosophy have developed as richly without access to patristic and classical sources? Would European civilization have taken a fundamentally different path? These are counterfactual questions, impossible to answer with certainty. But they help us appreciate what the Carolingians achieved. They prevented a cultural catastrophe. They maintained continuity with the ancient world at a time when that continuity was threatened. They created institutions and practices that enabled knowledge to survive and be transmitted across generations. They did this not because they could foresee our modern world or understand how their work would influence it, but because they valued learning for its own sake and believed preserving it was worth the enormous effort required. Charlemagne's role in all this was crucial, but not solitary. He provided the vision, the resources, the political authority that made the cultural renewal possible. He created the conditions under which scholars could work and learning could flourish. He made education a priority of royal policy in a way no previous medieval ruler had done. But the actual work was done by countless others, most of them anonymous, whose daily labour in scriptoria and classrooms preserved knowledge and transmitted culture. The emperor died in 814 after more than 40 years of rule. He was buried in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, the magnificent building that embodied so much of his vision. His empire fragmented within a generation, divided among quarrelling grandsons. But the cultural renewal he had initiated continued, carried forward by the scholars he had trained and the institutions he had established. His military conquests were eventually rolled back or transformed into independent kingdoms, but his educational reforms persisted, shaping European civilization in ways that would have been impossible to predict or imagine. And at the heart of those reforms were the manuscripts themselves, the physical books that carried knowledge across centuries, which deserve our careful consideration. In libraries and museums across Europe, there are shelves of medieval manuscripts, many of them Carolingian, that have survived for over 1,000 years. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're the actual physical objects that Carolingian scribes created, the very pages they wrote on, the illuminations they painted, the bindings they sewed. They're tangible links to the past, allowing us to touch something that 9th century hands touched, to see exactly what 9th century eyes saw. Consider the Utrecht Psalter, created around 830 at the monastery of Hutvilus near Reims. It contains the psalms illustrated with extraordinarily lively pen drawings. Unlike the formal hieratic images in many medieval manuscripts, these drawings are energetic and expressive, full of movement and detail. They influenced medieval and Renaissance art for centuries, and the manuscript still exists now in the University Library at Utrecht, its pages still displaying those vivid illustrations after 1,200 years. Or consider the Lorsch Gospels, a magnificent illuminated manuscript produced at Charlemagne's court around 800. The manuscript is now divided between libraries in the Vatican and Romania, but both portions survive. The ivory covers are masterpieces of Carolingian art. The illuminations show sophisticated artistic technique. The text is written in beautiful gold and silver letters on purple-dyed parchment. This isn't just a book. It's a statement of imperial power and Christian devotion, a physical embodiment of the cultural values that the Carolingians promoted. The St. Gall monastery plan, drawn around 820, still survives in the library at St. Gall in Switzerland. It's not a text, but a detailed architectural plan showing the ideal layout for a Carolingian monastery. Every building is labelled church, cloister, library, scriptorium, infirmary, workshops, gardens, even the livestock pens and brewery. Looking at this plan, we can understand how the Carolingians envisioned monastic life, how they organised space for different functions, what they considered important enough to include. Countless other Carolingian manuscripts survive in various states of preservation. Some are complete and beautiful. Others are damaged, missing pages, or with faded text. Some have been rebound multiple times over the centuries. Others still have their original bindings, but all of them are survivors. Physical witnesses to the Carolingian commitment to preserving knowledge. These manuscripts tell us things that no written description could convey. We can see exactly what Caroline minuscule looked like, examine the formation of individual letters, understand why this script was so successful. We can study how scribes corrected errors, what notations they added, how they organised pages. We can see the quality of parchment, the colours of inks and paints, the sophistication of artistic technique. We can also see the human element. Scribes sometimes added personal notes in margins, complaining about cold hands or expressing relief at finishing a difficult manuscript. They drew little sketches, practiced letter forms, recorded stray thoughts. These personal touches remind us that these were real people. Not just anonymous copyists, but individuals with personalities and feelings. Some manuscripts show signs of heavy use. Pages are worn from frequent handling, margins filled with readers' notes, bindings repaired multiple times. Other manuscripts seem to have been rarely opened, preserved in libraries for centuries with minimal handling. Both patterns tell us something about how these books functioned, which texts were actively studied, and which were simply preserved for their own sake. The fact that these manuscripts survived at all is somewhat miraculous. Parchment is durable but not indestructible. It can be damaged by water, fire, mould, insects, rough handling. Medieval libraries faced constant threats: wars, fires, changing political fortunes, religious conflicts, simple neglect. Many medieval manuscripts didn't survive. We know of countless lost codices, mentioned in medieval library catalogues but no longer extant. Yet enough survived to give us a substantial body of Carolingian manuscript evidence. Libraries in France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, and other European countries hold significant collections. The Vatican Library has numerous important Carolingian manuscripts. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Austrian National Library in Vienna, the Bavarian State Library in Munich, many university and cathedral libraries across Europe all have Carolingian holdings. These manuscripts are now carefully preserved, kept in climate-controlled environments, handled only with gloves, studied by scholars using non-destructive techniques. They're being digitized, photographed in high resolution, and made available online so researchers worldwide can study them without risking damage through handling. This digitization is creating a new kind of preservation, ensuring that even if the physical manuscripts are eventually lost, their contents and appearance will be recorded. But there's something irreplaceable about the physical manuscripts themselves. Looking at a high-resolution digital image is useful, but it's not the same as seeing the actual parchment, observing how the ink sits on the surface, noticing the texture and colour variations, sensing the three-dimensional quality of the object. The manuscripts are artifacts, not just texts. They carry information not just in their words, but in their materiality, in the choices that scribes and illuminators made about how to create beautiful, functional books. When you see one of these manuscripts in person, in a library exhibition or museum display, you're seeing exactly what a Carolingian scholar saw. You're looking at pages that have been turned by countless hands for more than a millennium. You're witnessing a kind of time travel, a direct physical connection to the past that few other artifacts can provide. Books can be reprinted, but these manuscripts are unique, irreplaceable witnesses to the Carolingian commitment to preserving knowledge in beautiful, carefully crafted form. And that commitment, that dedication to preservation and beauty, created a debt that we still owe and rarely fully acknowledge. We live in a world saturated with written text. Books, screens, signs, documents, all around us constantly. Reading and writing are so fundamental to modern life that we barely notice them, take them completely for granted. But this literate world we inhabit rests on foundations laid by people we never think about. Medieval scribes who preserved texts across centuries of potential loss. Every time you read a classical author, you're reading something that survived only because medieval scribes, often Carolingian scribes, copied it. Cicero's philosophical works, Virgil's poetry, Livy's history, these exist today because 9th century monks sat in cold scriptoria and copied them, letter by letter, page by page. Without their labour, these texts would be lost, and Western culture would be fundamentally different and poorer. But the debt goes deeper than just preservation of specific texts. The Carolingian scribes and educators created a culture that valued learning, that saw knowledge as worth preserving and transmitting. They established institutions and practices that would carry education forward through the Middle Ages and into modernity. They developed tools like Caroline minuscule that we still use in evolved forms today. Think about the infrastructure of modern education: schools, curricula, libraries, the division of knowledge into subjects and disciplines. Much of this has deep roots in Carolingian practices. The idea that there should be systematic education available beyond just training for specific professions. That knowledge is worth pursuing for its own sake, that societies should invest resources in schools and libraries. These weren't inevitable or universal ideas. They were choices, and the Carolingians were among those who made them and made them stick. The humble lowercase letters you're reading right now are descendants of Caroline minuscule. When typeface designers created fonts for printing, they based their lowercase letters on Carolingian manuscript hands. Even digital fonts maintain this connection. The basic letter forms that Carolingian scribes developed 1200 years ago are still the standard for Latin alphabet writing. Every email you write, every text message you send, uses their letter forms. But perhaps the deepest debt is harder to articulate. It's about cultural continuity, about the transmission of knowledge and values across time. The Carolingian scribes were links in a chain connecting us to the ancient world. They received texts from earlier generations and passed them on to later ones. They didn't just preserve knowledge mechanically, they kept it alive, studied it, thought about it, found it meaningful enough to devote their lives to transmitting it. Without that continuity, Western civilization would have been fundamentally different. The Renaissance couldn't have happened, at least not in the form it took, without the classical texts that Carolingian scribes preserved. The development of universities in the High Middle Ages relied on the educational foundations that the Carolingians laid. Modern science built on natural philosophy and mathematical knowledge that survived because of Carolingian preservation efforts. This doesn't mean that everything the Carolingians did was good or that we should uncritically celebrate medieval culture. They were selective in what they preserved, allowing texts they didn't value to disappear. They promoted Latin at the expense of vernacular languages and cultures. Their education was restricted largely to men and to clergy. They embedded Christian biases into their preservation and interpretation of classical texts. But acknowledging these limitations doesn't diminish the genuine achievement or the debt we owe. They preserved enough, transmitted enough, established enough to make later cultural development possible. They saved the classical tradition at a moment when it was genuinely threatened with extinction in Western Europe. And they did it not because they could foresee how their work would influence our world, but because they valued knowledge and believed preserving it was worthy work. There's something humbling about recognizing this debt. These weren't people with advanced degrees or sophisticated technology. They were monks working by candlelight with goosequill pens. They made errors, had limited resources, struggled with difficult texts and challenging circumstances. Yet they accomplished something remarkable that continues to benefit us today. And most of them are completely anonymous. We don't know the names of most Carolingian scribes. We don't know their biographies, their personalities, their individual stories. They laboured in obscurity and expected no recognition beyond perhaps a mention in a colophon asking for prayers. Yet their collective work shaped civilization. This anonymity reminds us that cultural achievement isn't just about great individuals, though they matter. It's also about countless ordinary people doing necessary work, maintaining institutions, passing on knowledge, keeping things going. History tends to remember the Charlemagnes and Alcuins, the famous names, but the real work was done by hundreds of anonymous scribes and teachers, faithful to their task day after day, year after year. We should remember them with gratitude. We should acknowledge the debt we owe to people whose names we don't know, but whose labour we still benefit from. And perhaps we should think about our own obligations to future generations. What knowledge and culture we're responsible for preserving and transmitting, what future people might owe to our anonymous efforts. The chain of transmission that the Carolingians maintained continues, and we're part of it now, beneficiaries of past efforts and trustees for future generations. And that transmission, that passing of knowledge from generation to generation, reminds us how fundamental reading itself is to human civilization. When a Carolingian monk sat down to read a manuscript, the experience was profoundly different from how we read today, yet also fundamentally similar in ways that connect us across the centuries. Understanding both the differences and the similarities helps us appreciate what reading meant in the Carolingian period and what it continues to mean. Carolingian reading was almost always reading aloud or sub-vocalization, moving your lips and perhaps whispering the words even when reading alone. Silent reading was rare and considered remarkable. This meant that reading was always auditory as well as visual, that you heard the words as you read them, that rhythm and sound were integral to the experience. Latin poetry especially was meant to be heard, its meters and sound patterns only fully appreciating through vocal performance. Reading was also slower than modern reading. Partly this was because of the difficulty of texts. No spaces between words in many earlier manuscripts, though Caroline minuscule added spacing, abbreviations that had to be expanded mentally, unfamiliar vocabulary, complex syntax. But slowness also reflected a different approach to reading, one focused on deep engagement rather than rapid information extraction. Medieval readers practiced what later scholars would call lectio divina, a meditative form of reading particularly applied to scripture but extending to other texts. You would read a short passage, pause to contemplate its meaning, return to difficult phrases, seek deeper significance beyond the literal sense. Reading wasn't about getting through a text quickly, but about absorbing it fully, letting it shape your thinking and devotion. This intensive reading meant that medieval scholars read fewer texts than modern scholars, but knew them more thoroughly. A Carolingian monk might read the same psalms hundreds of times over his life, memorizing them, contemplating them from different angles, finding new meanings through repeated engagement. Modern readers tend to read widely but perhaps less deeply, encountering many texts but fully mastering few. The physical experience of reading was also different. Manuscripts were large, heavy, valuable. You didn't casually pick one up or read while lying in bed. Reading meant sitting at a proper desk or lectern, positioning the manuscript carefully, turning pages with attention to their fragility. Books demanded respect not just for their content, but as physical objects representing significant labour and expense. Carolingian readers also approached texts with different expectations and assumptions. They believed that authoritative texts, particularly scripture and the Church Fathers, contained layers of meaning, literal, allegorical, moral, anagogical. Reading meant excavating these meanings, not just understanding the surface sense. They believed that ancient authors possessed wisdom that modern readers should learn from, not critically examine or surpass. Reading was about receiving wisdom from the past, not challenging it. Yet despite all these differences, there's something fundamentally similar about reading across the centuries. The basic act of deriving meaning from written symbols, of encountering another person's thoughts through text, of being changed by what you read, this remains constant. When you read Virgil today, you're doing essentially what a Carolingian scholar did, interpreting Latin words, constructing meaning, responding intellectually and emotionally to the text. The Carolingian commitment to reading and literacy created conditions that eventually led to our modern literate world. Each expansion of literacy, each new technology that made texts more available, each cultural change that gave more people access to reading, built on the foundation that the Carolingians and others laid. From manuscript to printing press to digital text, the underlying act of reading persists, and that persistence suggests something important about reading's role in human culture. Reading isn't just a practical skill for acquiring information, it's a way of thinking, of engaging with ideas, of connecting across time and space with other minds. When you read Augustine or Cicero, you're having a kind of conversation with someone who died over a millennium ago. You're encountering their thoughts directly, not filtered through multiple intermediaries, not reduced to summaries or quotations. This is what the Carolingian scribes preserved. Not just texts, but the possibility of these conversations, these encounters across time. They couldn't know who would read the manuscripts they were copying centuries later. They couldn't imagine us. But they believed that texts were worth preserving, that future readers would value what they were saving, that knowledge should be transmitted forward. And they were right. We do value it. We do read what they preserved. We do benefit from their labour. The chain of transmission they maintained continues. Every time someone reads a classical author or a church father, every time a student studies Caroline minuscule or learns about Charlemagne's educational reforms, the Carolingian effort proves its worth again. There's something beautiful and humbling about this. Reading connects us not just to texts, but to all the people who have read those texts before us, back through the centuries. When you read Virgil, you're joining a conversation that includes Carolingian monks, Renaissance humanists, Roman schoolchildren, and countless others. You're part of a tradition of reading and interpretation that spans millennia. The Carolingian Renaissance was fundamentally about maintaining that tradition, keeping it alive through a dangerous period when it might have been broken. They succeeded. The tradition survived. And were heirs to that success, beneficiaries of their determination to preserve light in what they saw as darkness. As we near the end of our journey together, let's consider what that light meant and continues to mean. The Carolingian Renaissance is sometimes called a light in the Dark Ages, but this metaphor needs careful handling. The period wasn't as dark as Renaissance humanists later claimed. Learning didn't disappear entirely after Rome's fall. Monasteries preserved some texts and maintained some education throughout the early medieval period. But something was being lost, slowly and inexorably. Knowledge and literacy eroding generation by generation. And the Carolingian effort stopped that erosion, reversed it, rekindled something that had been dimming. Think of it as a candle being passed from hand to hand through a windy night. Sometimes the flame burns brightly, casting light all around. Sometimes it gutters and dims, threatening to go out entirely. What the Carolingian scribes and teachers did was cup their hands around that flame, protect it from the wind, nurture it back to strength, and pass it on still burning to the next generation. The darkness they were preserving light against wasn't just ignorance or illiteracy, though those were real concerns. It was also forgetting, the loss of connection to the past, the breaking of cultural continuity. Every text that was allowed to disappear, every school that closed, every library that was scattered represented a dimming of the light, a loss of accumulated human wisdom and achievement. The Carolingians understood this, at least intuitively. They saw themselves as preservers and restorers, not innovators. They looked back to Rome and to the early church as golden ages that had been lost and needed to be recovered. This backward-looking orientation sometimes makes them seem conservative or even reactionary to modern eyes. But it was precisely this commitment to preservation that saved so much. They preserved texts, certainly. But they also preserved ways of thinking, approaches to education, intellectual traditions. They preserved the idea that learning mattered, that knowledge was valuable, that culture was worth sustaining across generations. These ideas weren't universal or inevitable. Many societies have functioned without them, but once preserved, they became foundational to Western culture, shaping how education is valued and conducted even today. The light they preserved wasn't pure or untainted. It came filtered through Christian interpretation and medieval assumptions. Classical texts were read in ways the original authors might not have recognized. Theological concerns shaped what was preserved and how it was understood. The Carolingians created a specifically Christian classical synthesis, not a neutral preservation of ancient culture. But this synthesis was creative and valuable in its own right. It wasn't a corruption of something pure, but a transformation that allowed classical learning to survive in a Christian world. The conversation between classical philosophy and Christian theology, between pagan eloquence and scriptural truth, between ancient wisdom and medieval faith. This conversation enriched both traditions and produced new insights that neither possessed alone. And the light continued beyond the Carolingian period. The manuscripts they copied were read by later medieval scholars. The schools they established evolved into universities. The educational ideals they promoted shaped European culture for centuries. The Renaissance, that later great revival of classical learning, built directly on Carolingian foundations. Reading texts in manuscripts that Carolingian scribes had copied, using educational methods that descended from Carolingian schools. Even today, in our digital age when manuscripts seem archaic and memorizing Latin grammar seems pointless, we benefit from what they preserved. The intellectual traditions of the West, the texts that shaped Western literature and philosophy, the educational assumptions we often take for granted, all have roots that reach back through the Carolingians to the ancient world they worked so hard to preserve. The candle is still burning. The light they protected hasn't gone out. Every time someone reads a classical text, learns Latin, studies medieval history, that light shines again. Every time a teacher patiently explains grammar to struggling students, every time a librarian preserves old books, every time someone chooses to value learning over immediate practical gain, they're continuing what the Carolingians started. This continuity is profound and moving. Across 1,200 years, across countless changes in technology and culture and politics, something has been maintained. Not unchanged. Certainly, the light looks different now than it did in Carolingian times, but it's still recognizably the same light, the same commitment to learning and preservation, the same belief that knowledge matters and should be transmitted to future generations. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Carolingian Renaissance, that what we preserve, we become. The Carolingians chose to preserve classical learning and Christian wisdom. In doing so, they shaped themselves and their culture. They became a literate, educated society not by accident but by deliberate, sustained effort. And they passed on not just texts but the values and practices that made those texts meaningful. We face our own choices about what to preserve and transmit. In an age of information overload and rapid technological change, the challenge isn't acquiring knowledge but deciding what's worth keeping, what should be passed on to future generations. The Carolingian example reminds us that these decisions matter, that what we choose to preserve or let disappear will shape the future in ways we might not fully foresee. The light they preserved in darkness continues to illuminate our world, not perfectly, not without shadows, but brightly enough to read by, to learn from, to pass on to those who come after us. And in that ongoing transmission, in that refusal to let the light go out, we honour the unknown scribes and teachers who chose to preserve rather than forget, to illuminate rather than accept darkness. Their work continues in ours. The candle still burns, and it's now our turn to cup our hands around the flame, to protect and nurture it, and to pass it on still burning to the next generation, keeping alive the light that Europe learned to read by again. We've travelled together for 2.5 hours tonight, from the ruins of Roman libraries to the scriptoria of Carolingian monasteries, from Charlemagne's palace at Aachen to the candle-lit writing rooms where anonymous monks preserved the words of Cicero and Virgil. We've met scholars who crossed Europe to teach in a foreign land, watched scribes labour through cold winters to copy precious texts, understood how one emperor's vision became a cultural revolution that saved Western learning. From the darkness after Rome's fall to the light rekindled in 8th century monasteries, from the development of Caroline minuscule to the preservation of classical masterpieces, from educational reforms that spread across an empire to the human cost of all that dedication and labour, we've witnessed how Europe learned to read again. The answer, as honestly as I can give it, to how learning survived the early Middle Ages is this: through choice and effort, through the dedication of people who valued knowledge enough to devote their lives to preserving it, through institutions that maintained education even through difficult times, through the vision of leaders who understood that culture mattered as much as military might. It survived not inevitably, but because specific people in specific times chose to make it survive. And in choosing preservation over forgetting, they shaped the course of Western civilization. If you enjoyed this slow drift through the Carolingian Renaissance, if you found something valuable in this quiet exploration of medieval learning, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. These calm historical journeys take considerable time to research and create, and your support helps me continue making them. And if you have thoughts about this or requests for future topics, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Your engagement builds a community of people who appreciate learning presented peacefully. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever quiet corner you found for these hours of listening, I hope you found some comfort and some knowledge. I hope your breathing has slowed, that the tensions of the day have eased a bit. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, ready for rest. I hope your mind has wandered through 9th century scriptoria and palace schools, imagining candles flickering on parchment pages, hearing the scratch of goosequill pens copying Virgil's verses. Imagine, if you will, looking up at a monastery window late at night. Inside, a scribe is still working by candlelight, carefully copying a manuscript that will survive 1,000 years. He doesn't know you'll exist someday, doesn't know you'll read the words he's preserving. He only knows that this work matters, that these texts are worth saving, that knowledge should be passed on. He bends back to his task, forming each letter with patient care. The candle flame wavers but doesn't go out. The work continues, the light persists. And somewhere, centuries in the future, someone will read what he's writing tonight and be grateful for his dedication. We are those future readers. We are the beneficiaries of countless hours of anonymous labour in cold scriptoria. We read by the light that they preserved. And perhaps our task now is to tend that light as carefully as they did, to preserve and transmit what we've received, to ensure that the candle keeps burning for those who come after us. The Carolingian Renaissance teaches us that cultural continuity isn't automatic. It requires effort, dedication, institutions, and individual choices to value learning over easier paths. But when those choices are made, when the effort is sustained, the results can shape civilization for centuries. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you're connected to a long tradition of learners and preservers, that the words you read connect you to scribes and scholars across 1,200 years of transmission and care. Dream of parchment pages and patient hands, of libraries that smell of leather and ink, of monasteries where candles burned late as knowledge was preserved against the darkness. Dream of Alcuin at Aachen, of monks at Tours and Fulda and St. Gall, of all the anonymous teachers and copyists who chose to keep the light burning. And rest in the knowledge that their work succeeded, that what they saved enriches our world still, that the candle they protected still illuminates our darkness. Good night.